George Washington is often called the father of his country because he played a key role in the founding of the United States. He was the first president of the U.S. and also led the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He helped oversee the creation of the U.S. Constitution, which is the foundation of the country's government. The capital city of the U.S., Washington, D.C., is named after him, and his face appears on the U.S. dollar bill and the quarter. Washington didn't belong to any political party. He was a nonpartisan candidate when he ran for president in 1789 and 1792. He's the only U.S. president to have been unanimously elected by the Electoral College, meaning every elector voted for him. Washington was born into a wealthy family in Virginia, and after his father died in 1743, he inherited 10 enslaved people. In 1761, he bought a farmhouse called Mount Vernon, which he expanded into a large estate. By 1799, over 300 enslaved people lived and worked there. Washington eventually decided to free the 123 enslaved people he owned, stating in his will that they should be freed after his wife passed away. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and died on December 14, 1799, at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. He served as the leader of the colonial armies during the American Revolution and later became the first president of the United States. George Washington's early childhood was spent at Ferry Farm, located on the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg, Virginia. Not much is known about his early years, and many of the stories about him, like the famous tale of him chopping down a cherry tree, are likely just myths. From age 7 to 15, Washington went to school irregularly. He first learned from the local church sexton, and then from a schoolmaster named Williams. Some of his school papers still exist. He was good at practical math, like measuring land and doing simple geometry, which was useful for his later job as a surveyor. He also learned a bit of geography, read some English classics, and possibly studied some Latin. At age 14, he copied down a set of rules about good behavior, which he kept carefully. However, most of his real education came from working outdoors and learning from experienced men. He learned how to grow tobacco and raise animals, and was skilled enough by his early teens to start surveying the land around him. When Washington's father died, 11-year-old George came under the care of his half-brother Lawrence, who was a kind and wise guardian. Lawrence inherited the estate of Little Hunting Creek, which he named Mount Vernon, and married Anne Fairfax, who came from an influential family. Living at Mount Vernon, George was introduced to a more refined and educated lifestyle. Anne Fairfax Washington was a cultured and charming woman, and Lawrence brought back a lot of knowledge from his time in England and the Navy. George also spent time with other relatives who helped shape his manners and thinking. As a teenager, Washington decided to become a surveyor. In 1746, Lord Fairfax, a wealthy landowner in Virginia, came to America to manage his vast lands and sent a team to survey them. Washington, at age 16, went along as an assistant and kept a diary of the trip. This diary shows that he was observant and experienced some tough conditions, like sleeping with only a thin blanket in a lice-infested area. He also encountered an Indian war party and described the German immigrants he met as being very much like the Native Americans, as they didn't speak English. In 1749, with the help of Lord Fairfax, Washington was appointed as the official surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. For the next 2 years, he worked hard, surveying lands in various counties and traveling deep into the wilderness. This work made him strong, both physically and mentally, and gave him a lasting interest in land development and western expansion. In 1751, Washington's life changed when he accompanied his brother Lawrence, who was sick with tuberculosis, to Barbados in hopes that the climate would improve his health. During this trip, Washington caught smallpox, leaving him with light scars. After Lawrence died in 1752, George inherited Mount Vernon at the age of 20. He loved farming and considered it the most enjoyable and honorable profession. He believed Mount Vernon was the best place to farm and was proud to be seen as a leading farmer in the country. Washington gradually expanded Mount Vernon until it covered over 80 acres. He enlarged the house and made improvements to the estate, focusing on crop rotation, soil fertilization, and livestock management. Even though he owned slaves, he strongly disapproved of slavery and hoped it would be abolished. He refused to sell slaves because he didn't want to break up families, even though their growing numbers were a financial burden. In his will, he ordered that the slaves he owned be freed after his wife's death, and that those who were too young, old, or sick be cared for by his heirs. His wife eventually freed all the slaves in 1800 after Washington's death. For fun, Washington enjoyed riding horses, fox hunting, dancing, watching plays, and fishing. He also liked playing billiards and cards, and he ran his own horses in races. He was an excellent horseman and athlete, described as tall, muscular, and very graceful. He became involved in community affairs, served as a church leader, and expressed a desire to run for the Virginia House of Burgesses as early as 1755. Early military career of George Washington, a pre-revolutionary journey. George Washington's early exposure to military life was significantly influenced by the tales of his great-grandfather John Washington's exploits as an Indian fighter, and by his half-brother Lawrence Washington's stories of military service. These experiences kindled George's own ambition to pursue a military career. Following Lawrence's death in 1752, Washington was appointed by Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie as adjutant of the Southern District of Virginia, earning $100 a year. By 1753, he had also taken on the role of adjutant for the Northern Neck and Eastern Shore. Later in 1753, Governor Dinwiddie faced the challenge of growing French encroachments in the Ohio Valley, a region claimed by the British Crown. After an initial messenger failed to deliver Dinwiddie's warning to the French, Washington was selected for the task. On October 31, 1753, he embarked on a perilous journey to deliver the ultimatum, accompanied by a Dutch interpreter, the seasoned scout Christopher Gist, and 4 others, including 2 experienced Indian traders. Though Britain and France were technically at peace, tensions were high, and Washington's mission carried the weight of a looming conflict. The French were to leave or face removal by force. The expedition proved arduous and fraught with danger. Setting out from what is now Cumberland, Maryland, Washington and his party navigated harsh winter conditions in the untamed wilderness, eventually reaching Fort Le Boeuf in what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania. The French commander received Washington courteously, but firmly rejected the ultimatum, declaring their intention to occupy the Ohio Valley. Washington's return journey was equally treacherous. An Indian fired at him from close range but missed, and a mishap on the ice-filled Allegheny River nearly cost Washington his life. Despite these challenges, Washington made it back to Williamsburg, Virginia, on January 16, 1754, where he promptly documented his experiences. Dinwiddie, eager to alert the British government to the French threat, had Washington's report published, which garnered attention in London. Dinwiddie soon launched an expedition to assert British control over the Ohio region. He appointed Joshua Fry as the regiment's colonel, and Washington as lieutenant colonel, tasking them with raising troops. As the French seized the fort at the Ohio Company's outpost, later known as Fort Duquesne, Washington pressed forward with his forces and constructed his own defensive position at Great Meadows. On May 28, 1754, he led a surprise attack against a French detachment, killing their commander, Coulon de Jumonville, and capturing the remaining soldiers. This event marked the beginning of the French and Indian War. Promoted to full colonel and reinforced with additional troops, Washington soon found himself besieged by a much larger French force at Fort Necessity. On July 3, 1754, after a day-long battle, he was forced to surrender. Although he and his men were allowed to return to Virginia, Washington was required to sign a document accepting responsibility for what the French described as the assassination of Jumonville, a term Washington later claimed to have misunderstood. Despite the setback, he returned to Virginia with a growing reputation, earning praise from the House of Burgesses and mentions in London newspapers. The arrival of General Edward Braddock in early 1755 presented Washington with new opportunities. Although he had resigned his commission in 1754 due to grievances over the treatment of colonial officers, Washington was eager to continue his military career. Braddock, recognizing Washington's potential, invited him to join the campaign against Fort Duquesne as his aide-de-camp, with the honorary title of colonel. Washington's assertiveness and leadership quickly became evident, even as he and Braddock clashed over the pace and logistics of the campaign. During the disastrous ambush near Fort Duquesne on July 9, 1755, Washington demonstrated remarkable calm and courage. Despite suffering from illness, he managed to rally the troops and was instrumental in salvaging what remained of the force. He had 2 horses shot from under him and his coat was pierced by bullets, yet he emerged unscathed, a fact that only added to his growing legend. After Braddock's death, Washington helped lead the survivors back to safety, solidifying his reputation as a resilient and capable leader. In August 1755, Washington, then only 23 years old, was appointed commander of all Virginia troops. However, his subsequent service was marred by challenges. He faced the daunting task of defending a vast and sparsely populated frontier with limited resources and support. The rigors of this duty eventually took a toll on his health, and by the end of 1757, he was gravely ill. After recovering, Washington resumed command in 1758 and played a key role in General John Forbes's campaign to capture Fort Duquesne. Although Washington disagreed with Forbes's decision to forge a new road westward, he contributed significantly to the operation. The French ultimately abandoned and destroyed the fort, allowing Forbes to establish Fort Pitt on the site. Shortly thereafter, Washington, having been elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, resigned his commission with the honorary rank of Brigadier General, marking the end of his pre-revolutionary military career. The early military journey of George Washington. Before the Revolution, George Washington's military ambitions were deeply rooted in his family's history. He grew up hearing stories about his great-grandfather John Washington, known for his role as an Indian fighter, and his half-brother Lawrence Washington, who had served in the military. These stories fueled George's own desire to pursue a military career. After Lawrence passed away in 1752, Washington inherited a significant responsibility. Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie appointed him as the adjutant for the Southern District of Virginia, a role that came with a salary of $100 per year. By the following year, he had also taken on the position of adjutant for the Northern Neck and Eastern Shore. In 1753, the situation in the Ohio Valley was tense. The French had started making advances into territory claimed by the British, sparking concern among the British colonial leadership. When an initial attempt to warn the French to leave the area failed, Washington was chosen for the job. On October 31, 1753, he set off on a dangerous mission to deliver an ultimatum to the French, accompanied by a small group, including an experienced scout named Christopher Gist and a Dutch interpreter. Despite the official peace between Britain and France, the atmosphere was charged with the threat of conflict, and Washington's mission was crucial. The French had to vacate the region or be forcibly removed. Washington's journey was a grueling test of endurance. Starting from modern-day Cumberland, Maryland, he and his team braved harsh winter conditions and treacherous wilderness to reach Fort Le Boeuf, located in present-day Waterford, Pennsylvania. Although the French commander received Washington courteously, he refused to comply with the ultimatum, stating that the French intended to hold on to the Ohio Valley. The return trip was equally perilous. Washington narrowly escaped an ambush by an Indian and almost drowned in the icy Allegheny River. Nonetheless, he made it back to Williamsburg, Virginia, by January 16, 1754, where he quickly documented the details of his mission. Governor Dinwiddie, eager to highlight the French threat, had Washington's report published, catching the attention of British authorities in London. The situation escalated rapidly. Dinwiddie organized an expedition to assert British control over the Ohio Valley, appointing Joshua Fry as the regiment's colonel and Washington as lieutenant colonel. As the French captured a fort at the Ohio Company's outpost, which would later be named Fort Duquesne, Washington led his men to establish their position at Great Meadows. On May 28, 1754, he launched a surprise attack on a French scouting party, resulting in the death of their leader, Coulon de Jumonville, and the capture of the surviving soldiers. This skirmish effectively ignited the French and Indian War. Washington was promoted to full colonel and received reinforcements, but soon found himself besieged by a much larger French force at Fort Necessity. On July 3, 1754, after a day of intense fighting, Washington was forced to surrender. He and his men were allowed to return to Virginia under the condition that Washington signed a document acknowledging responsibility for what the French termed the assassination of Jumonville. Washington later claimed he had misunderstood the wording. Despite this setback, he returned to Virginia with his reputation intact and growing, receiving commendations from the House of Burgesses and recognition in British newspapers. In early 1755, Washington's military career took another significant turn with the arrival of General Edward Braddock. Although Washington had resigned his commission the previous year due to dissatisfaction with the treatment of colonial officers, he was eager to return to service. Braddock, seeing Washington's potential, invited him to join his campaign against Fort Duquesne as an aide-de-camp, bestowing on him the honorary title of colonel. Washington's leadership qualities quickly stood out, even as he and Braddock disagreed over the campaign's logistics. The campaign ended in disaster during an ambush near Fort Duquesne on July 9, 1755. Despite being ill, Washington displayed remarkable bravery, rallying the troops and helping to prevent a complete rout. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his coat was riddled with bullet holes. Yet he emerged unharmed. His near-miraculous survival only added to his burgeoning legend. After Braddock's death, Washington played a crucial role in leading the remnants of the force to safety, solidifying his reputation as a resilient and capable leader. In August 1755, at just 23 years old, Washington was appointed commander of all Virginia troops. However, the role was fraught with difficulties. Tasked with defending a vast frontier with minimal resources, Washington faced constant challenges. The strain of the job eventually took a toll on his health, and by the end of 1757, he was seriously ill. After recovering, Washington returned to command in 1758 and became an essential part of General John Forbes's campaign to capture Fort Duquesne. Although Washington disagreed with Forbes's strategy to build a new road westward, his contributions were vital to the mission's success. The French ultimately abandoned and destroyed Fort Duquesne, allowing the British to establish Fort Pitt in its place. Shortly after this victory, Washington resigned his commission with the honorary rank of Brigadier General, having been elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. This marked the end of Washington's military service before the American Revolution, setting the stage for his future role as the leader of a new nation. During the early part of the American Revolutionary War, George Washington took command in July 1775 and led the Continental Army until the British evacuated Boston in March 1776. During these 8 months, Washington instilled discipline in his troops, which numbered just over 20 at their peak. Despite conflicts among his subordinates, he maintained a strong siege around Boston. He also supported plans to invade Canada, giving Benedict Arnold 100 men to attempt to capture Quebec. Washington encouraged privateers to disrupt British trade and secured ammunition and heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga to strengthen his position. Recognizing the strategic importance of Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston, Washington seized it on March 4, 1776, forcing the British to evacuate the city on March 17. He then moved his forces south to defend New York. In April 1776, Washington arrived in New York and placed part of his army in a vulnerable position on Brooklyn Heights, Long Island. When the British Army under General Howe arrived, they outmaneuvered and defeated the Americans, capturing 20 men. However, Washington managed to evacuate the remaining troops across the East River to Manhattan under the cover of fog. Despite further defeats, Washington skillfully retreated into New Jersey, with his army dwindling and morale low. At the end of 1776, in a desperate moment for the Revolution, Washington launched a surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas night. Crossing the icy Delaware River, he led 400 men in a snowstorm and defeated the Hessian forces, capturing nearly 10 prisoners. This victory reinvigorated the American cause. Shortly after, Washington outmaneuvered the British again at Princeton, inflicting further losses and retreating to a strong position in Morristown, New Jersey. These victories boosted American morale and attracted new recruits to the Continental Army.